Professor Burkett, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats.
Thank you very much, Kathy. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And I always look forward to especially speaking with your students who have really represented you well and are very thoughtful. So thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you. And we were hoping you might start with just some opening comments on the topic of the first principle of national sovereignty, and then we can go to some questions.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I love this topic, by the way. This is a central question, the importance of sovereignty in my graduate dissertation, which was years and years ago. But I became fascinated with the idea of why Americans were so concerned with independence. And it turns out that independence, being politically independent from another country, for one people to be politically independent, is vital to have and possess and use this thing we call sovereignty. And so if we ask ourselves, what does sovereignty mean? The term itself is sort of a carryover, old-fashioned term that it really just means having the power to do things. So think of old kings, right? Kings in the older days were called sovereigns. So whoever has the power to make decisions and do things on behalf of the state or the country was considered to have sovereignty. And so when we Americans start talking about sovereignty, what we are referring to is the power, the ability that we have as a people through our elected officials, through our government, to make decisions that we think are best for us and for others as well, in those cases where we have to where we do interact with other nations and other peoples. So sovereignty means the ability to make decisions, the power to make decisions. And independence, being politically independent, means we are free as a people or as a country to make those decisions, to use that sovereignty. So if we were politically dependent, for example, on another country, as say Americans were under the British, right, leading up to the American Revolution, Americans living in the colonies in America, they may have been one people in the sense that they held certain common opinions and principles and thought in similar ways, but they were politically dependent on the British to make decisions on their behalf. And so declaring independence from the British was the first step in establishing American sovereignty. And so this idea of sovereignty is such an important idea that it's in the very first paragraph. It is a major topic of the very first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And the first paragraph of the Declaration explains why independence is so necessary, not just winning one's independence, but maintaining one's independence as a country is vitally important in order to exercise that sovereignty. And just to make the point extra clear, the Declaration of Independence ends with a statement about the importance of national sovereignty. And so clearly this was an important thing, an important question, an important idea for the American founders, who believed that independence was vitally necessary for sovereignty, but sovereignty is important for us as a people to make decisions on our own without being told what to do by other countries or other powers. So that's a general introduction to the idea of sovereignty and where we find it in the Declaration of Independence. And I'm really looking forward to questions and going into more detail, if you like, on where we see these things brought up in the founding, or how they tried to apply it and how they tried to defend it, and these sorts of things. So.
Well, thank you so much. And we really appreciate the essays that you wrote in our current 90-day study on that topic, and especially your observation, the Declaration of Independence begins and ends with that principle. And we are going to drop those links into our Q&A for all of our listeners. And I'm going to go to Janine now. And Janine, I'm sure you've got some questions.
I do. Thank you. And it's great that we have a definition of sovereignty, meaning complete power. I watch all these historical shows, back during the times of kings and queens in England. They always talking about the sovereign Lord. sovereign lord, things of that nature. Well, your essays are always wonderful, and I reread your essays today, and equally as impressed with them. You talk about kind of a stair step of sovereignty, that first we believed when we came over, we had a certain amount of sovereignty, the Mayflower Compact, and governing ourselves over here in this new land for Europeans. So there's personal sovereignty. There's in the sovereignty of independence and liberty and rights, and then there's the sovereignty within a nation and how the nation protects those. The government protects those rights for us, and that responsibility. So a lot of times we think our government's powerful, but really the government, would you agree, is supposed to be not sovereign, but protecting our sovereignty. And then also protecting the sovereignty of the country against other countries. So, talk about that stair step a little bit, would you, from the minute, Europeans landed on this soil through the Declaration of Independence that you've already touched on, but also sovereignty today. And of course, Washington didn't want us to be enmeshed with Europe at all, or any other nation. And but the conflicts we have today are so complicated. We have the NATO alliance, we have the UN, we have things of that nature where we are connected. And there's that fine line between what we've promised we'll do if one nation is thrown into war, but then we kind of have sovereignty and we don't. It's an interesting concept. I mean, it's interesting because that's how World War I and World War II happened. One thing happened in a European country and then everyone got involved. And I think we're still in that position as we're against. But then again, we're at risk now too with this new alliance between Russia and China on our shores off the coast of Alaska recently. So anyway, I'm tossing you the generalities over to you.
Yeah, I think the point you made earlier is a vitally important point, and that is that we need to make a distinction, and Americans have always typically made a distinction between, who holds the sovereignty, who has sovereignty in this country. And as I was saying earlier, in the days of kings or in a monarchy, it is the government. It is the person wielding the power or influencing the government that has the sovereignty. So kings were sovereigns. But in this country, which is a republic, the people actually are sovereign. It's not the government. As you were saying, Janine, earlier, our government is not sovereign. The people are sovereign, and they operate or they exercise their sovereignty, again, meaning the ability to do things and make decisions that they think are right. We exercise that sovereignty through the government, and at the same time, as you said, our government is responsible for protecting the sovereignty of the people, which means they shouldn't violate that sovereignty themselves through unconstitutional or unjust laws, and they have to protect our sovereignty as American people from foreign threats. So I think you got right to the heart of the way Americans have always thought about sovereignty. It is us, it is we, the people. That's why the Constitution begins with that line, we the people. If you read the preamble to the Constitution, why do we ordain and establish this Constitution? For various reasons, right? But in that statement, we the people, what we're saying is, in this country, we are sovereign. We hold the sovereignty. So I think that's a really important point that you started with. The way these ideas start to come about, and I'll try not to go too far back and take too long with this, but as you said, Janine, in the early colonial era, as mostly British, but not just British, but a lot of British subjects are coming over to the American colonies, they're so far distant from the king and the parliament back in England that they begin to exercise, as you said, sort of private or personal sovereignty. That is, they're just free to live their lives. And yes, they have to obey British laws and the pronouncements of the king when they finally hear about them 3 or 6 months later, right? But American people living in the American colonies are free to live their lives and organize themselves into communities largely as they see fit. And so even while the Americans in these colonies, or the people in these colonies, they're still legally British. They are exercising that kind of independent or private sovereignty that you're describing. And for a long time, as you know, you've heard the term salutary neglect. It's a term that was beaten into my head, pounded in my head as a student. The British for a long time are sort of neglecting, not paying attention to what's going on over here, and leaving people living in the American colonies alone to live their own lives. So Americans, even when they were legally under the control of the British in the late 1600s and the first part of the 1700s, they're doing their own thing. They are sort of like, in fact, sovereign, not legally sovereign, but in fact sovereign. And so in the 1760s, when the British start passing acts and laws that the American people don't like and think are unjust, they say to themselves, look, we've been making these decisions for ourselves. Now all of a sudden the British want to exercise sovereignty on our behalf, and we're not going to take it. So you might say, in a certain sense, the American Revolution was about this question of whether or not the people living in the American colonies were going to remain sovereign in fact, or whether they were going to have to surrender that sovereignty back to being sort of sovereign, or not being sovereign legally under the British. But by that time, Janine, as you know, by 1772, 74, 76, Americans are so used to being sort of, again, independent and sovereign, not politically independent, but they're so used to it by that point. It seems almost inevitable that we're going to make a claim at some point that we are no longer going to be part of the British Empire. So does that help? I hope that makes sense.
It does. Were they allowed? Were they allowed? I know we had the first congresses, the Continental Congress and whatnot, that I think that was sort of our underhanded, we're going to call our own congresses. Was it called the House of Burgesses before? What did they call it before? And were they, who were elected to those bodies before, say, the Continental Congress?
Yeah, great. Yeah, and Virginia had a House of Burgesses, and the various colonies had their own local legislatures, their local governing bodies. And they were elected by and large by the people living in those colonies. So again, we had our own, Americans had their own local governments, even when they were under the British. And so one of the complaints against the British leading up to the Revolution and in the Declaration of Independence is that the king has tried to shut down our local governments. They were our governments. And as you said earlier, Janine, the purpose of government is to exercise our sovereignty and protect our sovereignty, right? Or exercise sovereignty on our behalf. So now the British are coming in saying, well, no, we're going to take that sovereignty back. Your local parliaments or your local legislatures no longer have that sovereignty. They no longer have that control to do things. We now get vetoes. I mean, they had vetoes, technically and legally, prior to 1776 or the 1770s, but they rarely exercised those sort of vetoes or those controls over sovereignty. So again, this is just another great example of how Americans are acting as though they are sovereign long before they're sovereign. And so
the king is saying, I'm sovereign, and the people are saying, no, actually, we're sovereign. We've been over here by ourselves all this time, making all this work. So that was the conflict. Yeah,
I think you're exactly right. Yeah, the king and Parliament in the 1760s of course, it's connected to the French and Indian War, and there's a plan to get the American colonists to pay back the British expenses that were incurred during the French and Indian War. But as soon as the Parliament started passing those taxes and Americans sort of kicked back and resisted, then the king and Parliament said, hey, we're going to remind those Americans that we are actually sovereign. And the more they tried to remind them, the more Americans kicked back.
Right. And the taxation, they were upset because they didn't think they had representation. Yet if they had representation in their own colonies, where were they not having the representation? Where did that happen?
Yeah, we did have representation in our own colonies. We didn't have representation in Parliament across the pond in England, right? So there were
we didn't have it over there.
Right. But we did have representation here.
Uh-huh.
And
so
now
when
all of a sudden,
they said no representation, they're talking about over there.
Right. Yeah. And again, prior to the 1760s, early 1770s, a lot of decisions are about what kind of laws we need and what policies we want and how best to defend ourselves from threats and how to sort of regulate internal economies in our colonies are done in the colonial legislatures here in the American colonies. And then again, all of a sudden, Parliament starts saying, you know what, we're going to start making these decisions for you again. And that leads to, the series of taxes in the 1760s, and then the Intolerable Acts and the attempts to close down colonial legislatures and take over the courts. And really, it's an escalating assertion on the part of the British to say, you guys are not sovereign. And Americans, or people living in the American colonies, are saying, well, we have been. So, why can't we continue on the way we've been? And sort of, in fact, there were people making this argument who weren't in favor of independence at first. So some people were saying, if we can just go back to the way it was, you guys take care of you British take care of the big questions like regulating trade in the Atlantic, and leave us to deal with our local issues, right? Things that affect us most immediately, and pass our own laws. We can go back to that way of things and remain part of the British system, and yet we can continue to exercise our kind of, sovereignty. And there were people who tried to sort of negotiate that with the British, and the British said, no, we need to just crush this idea of any idea of American sovereignty outside of the power of Parliament and King. So, and so we know what happened next, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that there weren't enough, they just didn't understand the spirit of Americans and what was happening over here. And they did have representation over here, the British did. But it's interesting that there wasn't that communication with Britain to say, wait, you don't know who you're dealing with over here. These people are, survivors. They've been through a lot.
Hey, Janine, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I just say, that's such a great point that you made. I just want to throw out there, you may have heard of Edmund Burke.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a member of the British Parliament. He was not American, but on your point, he understood, I think, pretty well this whole mindset of the Americans over in the colonies, and he tried to give to educate Parliament, and he gave a great speech called something on reconciliation with the American colonies, in which he tried to tell them, look, you've got to understand, these Americans have been living this way all this time. They believe in individual liberty. They've been exercising a kind of sovereignty. And so he tried to teach Parliament to understand, but they didn't get it. So that lack of communication thing that you pointed out is such an important point. Some of them did get it, but most of them didn't.
Yeah, I have read some of them did warn the king. Wait, you don't know who you're dealing with over there. But Edmund Burke, that'd be a great speech, that'd be a great piece of literature to read and to hear his speech through the written word. Today, I'd be encouraged. I'm encouraged to read that. So, before I pass this on to others who would like to ask questions, let's talk then about we won our sovereignty, and then we were. What's interesting is I love to study history, and it was the king, and of course it's happening now. People think this is archaic, but it's happening now under dictatorships in China and communist countries and whatnot. But the king, when the king said, I'm taking all your sons and all your, we're going off to war, and you're going to do what I say. And we're going to go into conflict here and conflict there. I was just watching this about the 100 Years' War. Well, the War of the Roses also, which was such a civil war in between, but they were always obsessed with France. Let's go tell you. And they drug everybody into it. And so wherever Britain wanted, it's like no one really had a say, because the people weren't sovereign to say, we don't want to go over to France and do this. And we don't, we want to, no, thank you. You get your head chopped off if you said no. If the king wanted you to go, you had to go. But they were always embroiling themselves in foreign, they just kind of kept it going. It was sort of a way of life, right? It's like, okay, what war are we doing next? And, who are we going to take? And then George Washington and our founders, when we were here, it's like, no, wait a minute, we're not going to get involved. We're going to have a national sovereignty and not become embroiled. And I think that was unique. It was we talk about all the uniquenesses of our founding documents, but that was really unique in itself as well. That, wait, not only we're going to make all this, we're going to set the bar here for all these other things about freedom, we're not going to get involved in all, we're not going to be pulled into all these wars with foreign nations. And they had learned that from centuries and centuries of all this political intrigue and heads getting chopped off and going to this war and that war. So that was novel too, was it not at that time?
Yes, it was. And in fact, you put your finger on, I think, the most important figure in George Washington on this. This is a fellow who was, in his entire public life, was constantly sort of teaching and, if not warning, Americans to be careful about their independence and not allow themselves to get embroiled in European wars. He described the European war, Europe is constantly a war, and not just that, but capricious wars is what he called them. Just sort of silly. Sometimes they just go to war over what you might consider silly reasons, unfounded reasons. Sometimes it's over territory. Sometimes somebody's insulted somebody, and you go to war, right? I mean, if you've read Shakespeare's Henry V, it starts with the.
I just watched all of them.
Right? Right.
The Hollow Crown.
The Hollow Crown. Yeah.
It's all
Tennis
of them.
balls. Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, tennis balls start a war,
Yeah.
right? So you insult somebody. So Washington said repeatedly in his career, we've just won our independence. The last thing we want is to give it away by tying ourselves or attaching ourselves to causes like to this nation or that nation in Europe, and we tie ourselves to those causes because the nation who attaches herself to the passions or by her passions to any other country loses her independence. That's how we get drawn into wars and conflicts. Washington saw very well. And by
then
the way,
if they win, they take over some of our territory.
there's always, look, yeah, that's right. Washington, again, I'm referring mainly to his farewell address, but Washington gave speeches on this throughout his political career. So in his farewell address, which he gave at the end of his second presidential term in 1796, he said, let's always be wary of political favors. There's always a catch. There's always a tie, right? There's something always that, so if one nation tries to help you now, guess what's going to happen later? They're going to want you to repay the favor. And Washington learned this sort of the hard way, because in 1778, as the American Revolution is still going on, the War for Independence is still going on, we signed some treaties with France, as you know, Jeannie. This is what leads to this whole terrible situation or messy situation in the 1790s. So we signed these treaties of alliance with France, and France comes over and helps us fight the British in our revolution. And when Congress was considering these treaties, George Washington is off in the field leading the Continental forces fighting the war. You have letters from him, you can read them, where he's writing to people saying, I don't know if this is such a good idea. I mean, it'd be great to have the help of the French, but if we agree to these treaties, someday they're going to want us to repay the favor. And so by agreeing, a treaty, by the way, is always a dicey thing, as Washington said, because by signing a kind of open-ended treaty, as we did with the French, what that means is in the future, they may come back to you and say, we invoke the treaty, now you've got to come fight for us. And that's not what political sovereignty is.
But that's what they did. They
exactly
said, you come help us with the French Revolution. We didn't.
Right. Yeah. And fortunately, Washington, I say fortunately, I guess you can tell whose side I'm on here. I'm not going to hide it. Fortunately, Washington was president and said, we're neutral, right? And he doesn't change us from being pro-French or pro-British to be neutral. He just says, look, until Congress, that is, until the American people through Congress decide that we should get involved in that fight, he says we're neutral. That is, we are not taking sides in this. And so that causes a big firestorm, because there are some people who, especially the French, who thought we should be involved on their side in these European wars that they're spreading, right? That they're causing, that have become so messy and bloody.
And then the French thought we were siding with England, and then they got mad, and then that was the dangerous time which Adams inherited, President John Adams, which is, okay, we need to stay away, we need to continue to stay out of this, when everyone's kind of like, go. But so that was a sovereignty in the early days that was really important to establish.
Of course, yeah, very much so. And again, this is Washington who has learned this through his own career, but had also warned, let's be careful about. So a treaty. So Washington, by the way, was not opposed to treaties. He was in favor of economic treaties if they're mutually beneficial, and even maybe sort of short-term, like very limited treaties might work, but permanent treaties where we just say, hey, France, you help us. Anytime you need our help, we're going to help you when you're attacked. That's a permanent treaty. And Washington says that's like tying our hands. That puts the French in control of our destiny, right? Which means we don't get to make these decisions. So I think that question of working out how to maintain our sovereignty in the world around us was a big part of the learning curve we as Americans had to go through in the 1790s, right after our Constitution was ratified. So
would we say we're in that predicament now with China and Taiwan, this one China thing that we sort of agreed to? And so they're saying, well, all right, you agreed to this, we get Taiwan's ours, and suddenly we're saying, well, no, it's not. And what was that treaty? Was that a treaty?
Well, it's an agreement. It's
Executive agreement?
I don't think it's a formal treaty. Yeah, that was done sort of by agreement. But still, I mean, when you agree to something, here's the danger, Janine. This is where maintaining your sovereignty and independence get tricky, because you want to maintain your sovereignty and independence on the one hand, but you don't want to put yourself in a position where you have to violate a treaty or an agreement when it's contrary to your security.
What's that called? What's that called? The one China? What's it called?
Yeah, the one China policy. Yeah, that's going to be a tough one, where they're talking about the problem of what to do with Taiwan. That
we probably should not have gotten ourselves embroiled in that, or agreed to that long-term sort of philosophy, because now we're in a position where we're like, we don't know that we really agree with that. That's what Washington was talking about, right?
Yeah, but it's very difficult. See, there may be times when an agreement or a treaty is I think Washington's attitude was treaties is a last resort. Okay, if we can get by without them and do the things that we as a country need to do for our security and to promote our vital interests, then we should do it without a treaty. But I think he was realistic enough to admit or know that sometimes maybe a treaty or an agreement is just unavoidable. I think the idea was last resort, right? So if we can work things out without a formal treaty that binds us in the future, we should do that. So the question with China is such a touchy one. It's a hard, because this is a wrong decision in this kind of question is it could be really disastrous on like an existential level, right? So we're
it's hard to answer that.
Yeah.
So lastly, and then I'm going to ask about state sovereignty, because we've talked about personal sovereignty and national sovereignty, but in the middle of all that is state sovereignty.
Right.
Talk about that a little bit for a minute or two, and then I'll toss it over.
Yeah, no, this, by the way, is a big, I'm laughing, I shouldn't laugh at this, but it's funny, as somebody who loves to study history, this is partly what makes American history so interesting, is the difficulties and the challenges that we had to work through, largely through the first 100 years of our existence. So prior to the Constitution in 1787, again, the several colonies, and then after 1776 they become states, they're used to living as though they're sovereign, right? So in 1776, when we declare independence from France, there's a big question. Are all of those 13 now former colonies, now states, are they sovereign and independent? Do they continue in that state? Or are they part of a larger union in which they give up some of that sovereignty? And so for about 7-8 years, Americans are arguing over this. First, you mentioned, Janine, the Articles of Confederation earlier, right? The Confederation Congress. So under the Articles of Confederation, before the Constitution, the states are claiming they're sovereign and independent, which means they're control and they get to do what they want, just as individual nations would. But then it turns out that doesn't work very well when you say that we're also part of a union and we need to cooperate. So one of the things the US Constitution tries to do is form, according to the preamble, right, a more perfect union. And one of the ways you do that is by more clearly defining to what extent the states are sovereign. Now, here's the problem. That seems like a contradiction in terms, because prior to this, being sovereign meant you had complete control, right? Now Americans are introducing a new idea, right? Like Americans do. We introduce all these new ideas and it confuses everybody. It turns out states can be partly sovereign. They can be sovereign in some ways, but not sovereign in other ways. So when it comes to managing national security, regulating international trade, doing those big things that are necessary for the interests and security of the nation, in those regards, Congress or the national government is sovereign. In all other things having to do with sort of traffic laws or state laws, state economies and these sorts of things, the states remain sovereign. So there is a kind of, it's a hard concept for a lot of people to wrap their heads around at the time, but there's a kind of dual sovereignty or being fully sovereign in this sense, partly sovereign in this sense. And I think Americans really had to work on that. And in some ways that had to be resolved by the Civil War, interestingly enough, because wrapped up in the arguments with regard to slavery and whether or not slavery was just and whether it should spread to the territories, wrapped up in all of those arguments in the early 1800s, it's the sovereignty question is sort of wrapped up in that as well, right? Are the states sovereign? Are they fully sovereign? Are they partly sovereign? In what ways are they sovereign? And so that
And
changes
same thing
in the
with
20th century.
The Revolutionary War was like that too, because suddenly we needed to come together to win it.
Yeah, right.
So
That's right.
the states were sovereign, had their own
Right.
power, but in order to win it, we had to come together, and we had to do the same thing on a broader perspective of the Civil War. Really interesting. I'll just say in closing before I toss that, it's great having you on the show. It's really fun having this discussion, by the way. Terrific work.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The terrific work with every genre of our foundation where you help us. You were pivotal with our putting together our study last year about American exceptionalism. So I thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me be part of it.
Oh my gosh, I just really love that study. So it wouldn't be possible without you and Gordon Lloyd, right? God bless Gordon.
Yes.
Anyway,
bless
I think it's interesting for people to wrap their heads why history is so important. It really is, the past is prologue and history is the key to the future. Is the states, they had their own money. They had, we didn't even have a common currency at the time. That's how, and yet the states were sovereign, and yet they really still weren't, because they had to answer to Britain. So that's the whole complexity too. But when they weren't thinking about Britain, they were sovereign in the respect of all their own laws. Okay, I'm going to pass it over now. Thank you so much, Jewel and Jordan. You're on.
Hello.
Hey, Jewel, Jordan.
The question of sovereignty is really important to America, since our founding Declaration of Independence was this declaration of sovereignty. Can you tell me about the sovereignty of man, of the individual? Were those words used anywhere from our founding fathers? Do we find that idea brought down to the individual man?
Oh, that's a great question, Joel. Thank you. I can't think of that phrase being used, like the sovereignty of man. I know the French, by the way, will use that term in their revolution, and I think they try to incorporate the idea that you're getting at here, that the Americans have, but they don't quite get it. But what they did, so think about it this way, Joel. Independence, like nations have independence, and individuals have liberty. So what's liberty for an individual is like independence for a nation, in a way, right? So, and as we said earlier, independence is necessary for nations to be sovereign, and liberty is necessary for people. Here's the phrase they did use: liberty is necessary for individuals to be self-governing. So I think they mean the same thing as what you brought up, but I don't remember them quite using that term sovereignty to apply to individuals, but the parallel's there. So independence and sovereignty, liberty, self-governing.
That's interesting because I wonder if right there we see kind of why the French Revolution took an impetus that we link to American independence, but it was perverted in some way that allowed it to become bloody, and in a way that American Revolution, while it had blights, never became bloody the way the French Revolution did. And I wonder if part of that, then, based in your answer, is that the French they treated the political and the natural law of man almost as one thing, maybe collapsed them. So sovereignty would be a political thing between nations, but then maybe applied it to the man and then allowed for what we saw afterwards. It'd be an interesting thing to research, actually.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great question. Yeah, and I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize.
No, go ahead. Say what you're going to say.
Well, I'll try to be quick. I was just going to say, you've raised such a good point. So, and I don't mean to be too hard on the French and their revolution, their first revolution. But I think what they missed, because they misunderstood what you were bringing up here. As Janine said earlier, in America, we understand that the role of government is to preserve the sovereignty of the people, to protect it, right? And not to make us free as individuals, but to protect our individual liberty. So the French, during the 1790s revolution, didn't seem to quite get that. And they came to believe that government, or the state as they called it, was the thing that would make you free. That's where I think they made their big mistake, right? So they believed in national sovereignty, at least of France, by the way, as the French went around violating the national sovereignty of every other European nation. But they claimed their sovereignty mattered, but they didn't respect the sovereignty of other nations. But individuals had to be made free by their government. And I think that was a big difference. And I think that's why you see the French Revolution very quickly sort of turn to tyranny. And it becomes not so much individual liberty, it becomes you say and do what the state permits you to do, right? Like, oddly enough, no wearing short pants or whatever it was, right? You have to use certain terms when you're addressing your fellow citizens. You call them this, you have to call them citizen or something. So anyway, great. That's a great point that you've raised.
I do think, though, that as much as we don't only need to look at we don't only need to condemn everything in the French Revolution or just trash it all the time. It is useful. It really it enlightens how we can understand what's different in ours when we do see the differences and what happened because of it.
I agree.
And oftentimes modern failings, we can kind of see them in the French Revolution, kind of now, and in these ideas of where those ideas may go if they aren't all the way true.
Right.
I was wondering too, another question is that our founders primarily were, the colonies, a lot of it was financed by a company, by an industry, mercantilism, and we weren't against imports as a whole. But I do wonder today if they wouldn't look at our economic sovereignty as something that we don't necessarily have, and look at the current economic system as something that in a way violates our sovereignty, and the money that we do put into other places, and not just in war efforts, but also in and not only in aid, but in more so like into our funding that goes to NGOs and UN organizations. I wonder, do you think that they would see that and it would be something very alarming? Do you think that they would, in time of, as soon as they understood our modern world, that they would say, oh yeah, that's a normal development? Or do you think that is something problematic to our idea of sovereignty at the time of declaration?
Yeah, again, another great question. So I think if George Washington were around, this is dangerous. I don't want to put words into, how dare me put, who am I to put words in George Washington's mouth? But based on the ideas he laid out at the founding, I think he would say statesmen have to be very, very careful about these things, because I think you've picked up on something that they were aware of, but that wasn't quite as pressing as it is today. That is, we can lose our independence not just through treaties involving war and assistance in the war, but through economic agreements. We can lose our independence, or a degree of our independence, if we're not careful. And so just two quick examples, one of which you brought up, the amount of money that the United States pays to, or funds to the United Nations is enormous, as you know, right? And the question then is, what does the United Nations do with that money, and to what extent does the United States have a say in how the United Nations decides to use those funds, right? So the United States gives more than any other country by far to the United Nations and the things that it's doing. But the United States still, it depends. It goes up and down, depends sort of who's in office and who's in Congress. But we still tend to say we want some sort of control or say over how that money is spent and what it's spent for. Just a quick sort of prior to the United Nations, you probably studied the attempt to get the League of Nations passed after World War I. And one of the reasons that was vetoed by the Senate in 1920 is precisely because in the League of Nations, the United States would not have any kind of veto power over how our money was being spent by the United Nations. So that's a problem we've been aware of in the 20th century, and it has to be watched very carefully. But how about sort of tying the value of our dollar to to investments and selling gold, and gold being owned by foreign countries? That may be a more immediately dangerous policy for the United States if we're not careful, and other countries buy our debt and they're snatching up gold, which could affect very dramatically the value of the US dollar, and therefore affect how much of our debt and when we can pay it back. That's a really, really potentially dangerous situation that I think Washington and others would say we really need to be careful about, because if people control us economically and we still hold that it's important to pay back our debts, we could be under the thumb of foreign governments. And I think it's pretty well known that China has a policy of attempting to do that to the United States. And so we just have to be careful about it. But I think they would be cautious about this, Jewel. So
Yeah, and I
the
think
question.
I think there's a concerted difference of opinion that there's a worldview of sovereignty is the best way to run things in a concept of subsidiary, where the lowest down place of power should run the local things, town, city, state, and there shouldn't be a giant world power. And then there's other people say, no, we can make the world run more efficient if there's a big world power. But I don't think that we often as Americans grow up and then think about, okay, there's these competing ideas and people in our government have different ideas. And it's good shows like this. And when you're explaining it that way, we can see those ideas and that they do exist, what they are, and we can choose which we believe is right. Jordan, your question?
Yeah. So a lot of the ideas that the founding fathers put into our declaration were new. They were, brand new ideas. They were really very radical in a sense. Sovereignty is really not one of those ideas. Maybe to the extent that they put it in, but I'm just curious, what is like the clearest depiction? Like, what do we go back to look at for sovereignty? Like, when was it most prominent? Like, what example were they looking at in the past to see how to make then America nationally sovereign?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. That's a great question. In fact, you're right. The idea of sovereignty was not new at the time of the Declaration of Independence. But if you read the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence very carefully, what you find is there's a really radical statement in there that most people sort of gloss over. Because what Americans do is they change the basis of sovereignty. So again, I'm trying not to turn this into a long history lesson here, but prior to Americans, nations were sovereign based on the idea of consent. That is, what if you wanted to become a sovereign nation, you had to get the consent of other sovereign nations, which meant European nations. And this all sort of goes back to what's known as the Peace of Westphalia in the 1600s, where European nations for 100 years had been fighting each other over religion. And then at the end of the 100 years, they come together and they say, look, we're going to recognize the sovereign right of each country to have its own religion, which means Protestant countries don't have a right to come in and invade Catholic countries and vice versa and all this, right? So since the 1600s, what made a nation sovereign was a treaty, a series of treaties, that is consent by other nations. So if you wanted to be a sovereign nation in Europe, you had to get the consent of all other sovereign nations of Europe. So, Jorn, in the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, it says that in the course of human events, when it becomes necessary for one people to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. You see the shift that takes place? This is new. And only Americans believe this at the time. So what this means is we don't need the consent of any other nation. We hope they support us. And we're going to try to persuade them that we should be free and independent, we Americans. But we don't need their consent. we are entitled to be a country and to have therefore have sovereignty by these things called the laws of nature and nature's God. That is, this is the way God wants it. He wants peoples to be free to decide for themselves whether they want to be their own independent country and therefore exercise sovereignty. So that's a new idea that Americans introduce. And it's a pretty radical statement at the time. As I was saying, no other people in the world believe that except Americans. But it very quickly caught on. The French tried to do this, although it didn't quite work out for them. But I will point you to the sort of revolutions that take place in Latin America, in Central America, the Caribbean in the early 1800s, where a lot of peoples are throwing off the Spanish, their colonial overlords in the Spanish, and saying, we don't need anybody's consent to become independent and sovereign. We are entitled to these things by God and the laws of nature. So, Jordan, I hope that helps. That was a long-winded answer, but you raised such a great point.
Oh yeah, I think that the answer was totally necessary, because it's so easy to just skate over these little words and the assumptions that we can make because we're, living so many years after them. It's just, the little details really, and you really explained it very well for us and the audience. So thank you.
That was
I
a great
think
question.
we have to move to some audience questions now. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Jorn, and thank you, Janine, for all those great questions. And before we go to the audience questions, we want to give a shout out to our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV, the radio station that airs these programs Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific. And so we want to thank our listeners tuning in to 1060 a.m. On Las Vegas's KKVV Monday evenings. We also want to give a shout out to the educators that are watching with us today. Amy Winchester, University of Arizona College of Nursing. Fred Pursley has students watching with him at Mansfield Classical Academy in Ohio. Hope Mucklow, a homeschool family, as well as Cami Wanaus, homeschool family, and Lisa Fiffield with the American Heritage School in Salt Lake City. So we want to give a shout out to all of our great educators and students. And if I missed you, please write us in the Q&A and we'll give you a shout out as well. So Professor Burkett, we've got some great audience questions. I also want to share a question that Tova, even though she couldn't be with us, sent in. And Tova asked, Dr. Burkett, your research is focused on the American founding and the progressive era. Could you compare and contrast how the idea of national sovereignty has been regarded in each of these time periods, and what accounts for the differences in understanding?
That's such a great question. You could write a book on this. In fact, I've written a couple of chapters on this, but boy, she's insightful, isn't she? And her questions, something big does change around the turn of this 20th century in terms of how we think about our national sovereignty with a particular type of progressivism or progressive view. And I would point to somebody like Woodrow Wilson, for example, who believed that he had been given insights into the sort of future course of history and how the world was going to develop that led him to believe that national sovereignty was no longer our top priority. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson was absolutely willing to sacrifice the sovereignty of the United States to an international organization like the League of Nations, which was his brainchild. It was his baby. He envisioned a League of Nations in which individual countries came and gave up massive portions of their sovereignty to this international body that would make decisions on their behalf and on behalf of countries, non-member countries around the world who needed our help sort of becoming civilized. And again, without going too far into detail here, there's a different, Woodrow Wilson's views on the purpose of government and the nature of rights and the nature of sovereignty was informed by a very peculiar form of philosophy that was not around at the time of the American founding. Just to be sort of short here, and maybe it'll pique some people's interest in looking into this further. The American founders were influenced by thinkers like John Locke, who believed, again, in the idea that sovereignty matters, individual liberty matters, and government ought to be limited. And the purpose of government is to secure primarily the rights of its own citizens. Woodrow Wilson is influenced by a kind of German philosophy, and I won't go into it much further than that because it gets very complicated. But he believed that the reason we have government is so we can use it for the good of others around the world. And that means we have to put we Americans should put our interests and even our sovereignty and our security second to what we can do to promote the good of other countries and other peoples around the world and helping them become civilized and democratic. It was longer than I intended to be there. It's very complicated, but it's a big change that takes place.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer and great observations. And we have several listeners who are asking about the World Health Organization and how that decisions made there may or may not affect our national sovereignty. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I'll just say, I mean, again, from the point of view of the founding, since this is primarily what I study, I think if a World Health Organization is there to recommend policies that are good for everybody, that's great. They can be a recommendatory body. But the American founders would say should never put ourselves as a people in the position of having to simply obey the mandates of any body that is beyond the control of the American people. They can recommend things, but ultimately to say we simply have to obey those things and have no sort of control or even veto over them would be a serious loss of our sovereignty. So again, international organizations, we have to consent to the degree, again, from the point of view of the founders, people like Washington, we have to consent to the degree to which we will participate in those things. But ultimately the decision, if we're to be truly sovereign as a people, the ultimate decision on what we do with regard to the economy, health, war, treaties, it has to be up to us. And if it isn't, then we're not sovereign.
Well, thank you. And then Lisa Fiffield, one of our educators from Utah who's on, asked if you could go into depth a little bit more on the issue of China and the Communist Party. And Lisa asks if you could comment on various ways the Chinese Communist Party is undermining our individual sovereignty. And she's also writes about agreements that she observes the state of Utah. She says sees local government making agreements with the Chinese Communist Party directly. And
yeah, I know of some of the things that she's referring to, which I can't get into the specifics of those things, but there are states that are making trade deals and in fact selling U.S. territory, like actual land, to Chinese businesses that although they claim to be independent are really just puppets for the Chinese government. And I don't know how to resolve this or answer this in the few minutes that we have left, but this raises really important questions about the degree to which states are sovereign and how we find that balance again between the sovereignty of the states, the sovereignty of the U.S. government. We know though that the Chinese government is trying to actively get an advantage over the United States economically by expanding markets for its goods into territories that were sort of traditionally under the, I don't want to say under the influence, but more friendly toward doing trade with the United States. But the real way I think that they are trying to bolster their chances for sort of dominance in the future is by taking away American sovereignty, by controlling our economy, again, by buying up portions of the debt, trying to control the value of money. And these are very clever things that they're doing. And I know that Americans are aware of these things, but we have to watch this very carefully, which is, again, another reason why, back to the point that Jewel made earlier, maintaining a strong economy and controlling our economy to the extent to which we can control it is vitally important to maintain our sovereignty. Because if we lose control of our economy and we have to rely on foreign foreign debt or foreign aid or foreign assistance, we are no longer sovereign there as well. It's like any individual, right, who is relying on credit or on assistance or something like that, right? We have to be careful about the extent to which we remain truly free and independent.
Well, thank you so much. And we are at the top of our hour. We wanted to bring up real quick the AmericanFounding.org website that Ashbrook hosts and that Professor Gordon Lloyd spent so many years putting it together. It's just such a great resource. And we encourage all of our listeners to go and check it out, americanfounding.org. And if you scroll down, Jacob, you can see they divide it into several sections. We have a great tribute that you wrote, Professor Burkett. Thank you to Gordon Lloyd for his work on it. But you have the case for independence, you have the Constitutional Convention, you have debate and ratification, Bill of Rights, and then your resources library. And every one of those is just a treasure trove of information. So we encourage our listeners to check that out, americanfounding.org. And we thank you, Professor Burkett, as Janine said, for just all the ways that you are just so supportive of Constituting America's programs. And thank you for being with us today.
Once again, my pleasure. And I look forward to having a chance to do it again, hopefully someday.
Well, thank you. And thank you to our audience. We loved having you with us. And please come back next week, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about another founding principle, the principle of meritocracy. So we look forward to having you all back with us next week.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Burkett, Professor Burkett. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very nice to see you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.